So for our thesis statement, this brief episode, of course, in line of our ideals and interest in justice and in the pursuit of a good life, it is important for us Filipino philosophers to hold space for women and minorities in the discipline. And in this episode, I propose four parts. The first one is to feminize our canon. The second is to decolonize our text and our classroom approaches. The third one is by incorporating regional Philippine philosophies and languages and its research, of course. And the fourth one, supporting emerging women and minorities groups in the Philippines. So, if we may start this brief session, it is important for us to hit these goals. And I am proposing that we, as women philosophers here in the Philippine academe, hit these goals. Of course, not only in the philosophic tradition, but also in other fields of academic pursuit. So, for our introduction, we have to feminize our canon, we have to decolonize our texts, we have to incorporate our Filipino approaches into philosophizing and to support women and minorities because we have always experienced, we, as women philosophers, queer folk and other members of the LGBTQ, and those who are discriminated against by their race, ethnicities, religions, have always had this experience of marginalization in the philosophical discipline. And what is this marginalization? The first one is the gatekeeping of the canon or the philosophical traditions that are usually white, male, and, well, dead philosophers. And for some previous philosophers in the field, only those who are capable in quotation marks, or those who only study those dead white male philosophers are the ones who are considered to be philosophers. I think at this point for us women in philosophy, we have to call ourselves philosophers, not just because we are philosophers, but because we are reclaiming and claiming our space and our significance in the whole philosophical tradition of history. The second one is tokenism. For some of our successful women philosophers, and there are a couple of them in the field, not just here in the Philippines, but also in the world, there's always a model of what is supposedly a good woman Filipino philosopher. And these are paraded as the ideals of what a Filipina woman philosopher is supposed to be. Of course, in these contemporary times, we know that there are different ways of expressions, different modes of philosophizing, and different doings of how we research, investigate, do, and express philosophy. And in this struggle against tokenism, we open or we create more spaces. We support spaces and we support people who have different expressions of who they are, which may be tied to their expressions of philosophy and philosophizing. The third one is the struggles for recognition. I say struggles because it's not only a linear approach to a liberation of what might be a free philosophizing. These are struggles for tenure, struggles for applications, struggles for being heard, being seen, and doing what one wants to do. It's not just about a name, it's not just on or because of our activities, or it's not just because of how we dress for some, how we uh, express ourselves might be boldly, but for some, the struggles for recognition is a political stance so that we continue to give strength as well to our fellow women philosophers and to be models of what we are building as the current or the contemporary Filipino woman philosopher. And this includes the recognition again of our pluralism and our differences of coming and of differences of where we came from, differences of philosophical interests, and differences in how we might want to incorporate philosophy in our everyday life. The last one, since this is only a brief session on women and minorities in philosophy, is the continued sexism and misogyny in the workplace. And this would have include particular instances of claims that what Filipino women philosophers do are not philosophy, or for example, that feminist philosophy is not philosophy, and for just boxing or categorizing that it's only care work where women philosophers can shine, or it's only that the service and the extension work where women philosophers thrive. Me and all the other members of the current groups of women doing philosophy proves otherwise. There are many ways to do philosophizing, even within the academic space itself. And because we have been grouped or we have organized ourselves into this community, we continue to hold space and we continue to provide strength to our fellow Filipino women philosophers. Now, for the 4 points that I would like to briefly introduce ourselves for this session, the first one is how do we feminize our canon, or the importance of feminizing our canon when we are doing our class guides, when we are doing our classes in philosophy, and of course when we are entering conferences, and if we are designing projects and conferences in line with philosophy and philosophizing. The first one would be to include women philosophers, not only in the History of Philosophy series, but also the women philosophers and their works that are now living. This would also have to include their activities outside the academe, and this would also include whatever their creative skills are pertaining to their research, to their philosophical investigations. Part of feminizing our canon as well is to make sure that the plight of women philosophy, of women philosophers, of the queer folk in philosophy, and the minorities in my philosophy and philosophizing be included in our department university agendas, and that we design conferences, we design our FGDs, folk our roundtable discussions, our sessions on women and minorities, so that we can hear from them, or we hear from them, we hear from their own words, and we hear how their experiences are molded by the limitations that we keep on encountering in the discipline. I would also like to point out that there's one issue in the Critica Journal wherein Filipino women philosophers are the main proponent and the writers. And I would also like to mention that there's also a forthcoming book on resilience. Again, this is sponsored by the Brown Babes Burden Project of the Women Doing Philosophy under Dr. Grace Llanera. This again is a book project on resilience and the COVID pandemic and the experience of philosophy, written by Filipino women philosophers. This third one is an ongoing project as well with Beyond the Ghetto, having an online feminist classroom, which is an online repository, a feminist classroom, an online repository of the women of Filipino women's works on philosophy, and also the webinars wherein Filipino women philosophers are the speakers and the hosts as well. The next one is decolonizing our texts and approaches. I think it is time for us to provide our criticisms and to rewrite. For some maybe a rewrite, for some a revision, but a rethinking and a review of what decolonizing our texts and our approaches mean. So aside from feminizing our canon, I think it is also now time for Filipino women philosophers to give birth to whatever we have been researching with our specific philosophical interests. So these might mean that it's okay to not study dead white male philosophers, but to have philosophy and philosophizing articulated from our own lived experiences as Filipino women. The next one is that the encouragement or the support for incorporating regional Philippine philosophies and languages. Personally, this has been a project of mine to look into the possible or the different ways in which we use our Filipino languages when we are trying to philosophize, or when we are philosophizing. With the thousands of islands that the Philippine archipelago have, there is more than a possibility that we have a number, a couple, and a lot of more philosophies that has not been investigated and has not been talked about, just because the majority of the philosophy education or the philosophy programs are in the NCR. Nevertheless, we would also like to point out, of course, that with the rollout of the philosophy of the human person and the social senior high school classes or degrees, we can now consider that we have enough data to look into and to review how the SHS, philosophy of the human person, has impacted how young students understand philosophy and philosophizing as contextualized to the Philippine experience. The next one, and I think the last one for this session, is that it is important for us to support emerging women and minorities groups in the Philippines. So, what does this mean? With the founding of Women Doing Philosophy, an emerging group of Filipino women philosophers here in the Philippines, personally, I have found the power of organizing. And because of this, for 3 years, we have not just found our fellow women philosophers, but we have institutionalized a network that follows a deliberative practice, a network that is based on solidarity, and a network that follows the critical tradition of providing critical feedback and creative feedback to one another. But the important thing, from my own experience of being part of this group, is that we continue to hold spaces for Filipino women philosophers flourishing within and outside the academe. Personally, I think it is important for our minorities and marginalized groups in the Philippines to form our own communities, so that it's not only to provide help and support to our fellow professionals and fellow members, but also to build more spaces wherein we feel safe, we feel seen, and wherein which we can reclaim our power as who we are, not just as philosophers, not just as thinkers, but also as human beings. I think it's also important that we support these emerging groups so that they also see that they are not alone. The experience of marginalization often leads to alienation, angst, and desperation. I think as philosophers as well, we have that responsibility to make sure that we do not add any more suffering to our fellow philosophers, and to make sure that we provide the support and the solidarity that the marginalized sectors in philosophy and philosophizing is experiencing. And I think it is also important that when we hear issues and that when we hear grievances pertaining to the philosophical tradition, that we listen to the survivors and we listen to our marginalized philosophers. I would like to end this session with a brief sharing of is it like to be part of Women Doing Philosophy. It's an emerging group and the projects that it had been doing for the past 3 years. So, Women Doing Philosophy holds space for Filipino women philosophers here in the Philippines and all over the world. We are we are now pushing for our sect formalization, and we are happy, and we are hopeful that that would further solidify our presence with Philippine philosophical landscape. The WDP, or Women Doing Philosophy, also has active subgroups. The first one is our Beyond the Ghetto, or BTG, which again manages, hosts, and designs the BTG newsletter. And it also holds the webinar and designs the webinar themselves, wherein Filipino women philosophers share their philosophical works online. We also have the Resilience Group, which manages the Brown Babes Burden Project, with the upcoming book, which I mentioned earlier, on the Resilience Book Project. A book project written by Filipino women philosophers on the topic of resilience in the pandemic experience. We also have the Critical Social Theorists and Feminists Group. We are currently writing our own chapters or articles to form the project, The Philippine Condition, Threads of Critical, Decolonial, and Feminist Contentions. And we also have a newly formed subgroup which we call PhilPhil, or Filipino Philosophy. I would like to end the session by encouraging and supporting and to provide support and solidarity to the marginalized sectors in our philosophical discipline. And I would also like to reiterate the significance of the solidarity and the encouragement for the emerging groups. I would also like to recognize, of course, the presence of allies, and hopefully there are more allies that could help those who continue to experience marginalization, alienation in the philosophical field here in the Philippines.